Something about this war feels strangely familiar. Not because we have seen these exact events before, but because we have seen this pattern before. At first, everything looks decisive. Precision strikes, explosions lighting up the night sky, military briefings talking about strategic targets destroyed and leadership eliminated. For a moment, it appears as if the conflict might end quickly, that overwhelming power will force a rapid collapse. But history has a habit of misleading us in the early stages of wars, because the opening chapter of a conflict rarely tells you how the story will end. And when you step back and examine the deeper structure of what is happening right now, a very uncomfortable possibility begins to emerge. This war may not be designed to end quickly. In fact, almost everything about Iran's military and political strategy suggests the opposite. For more than 40 years, Iran has been preparing for one very specific scenario, a confrontation with a far stronger military power, not a small regional rival, a superpower. And when you prepare for that kind of opponent, you do not build your strategy around winning quickly, you build it around surviving. That difference is crucial because the United States and Iran are approaching this conflict with completely different definitions of victory. For the United States, success traditionally comes through overwhelming force applied in a short window of time. The goal is to break the enemy's leadership, destroy its infrastructure, and create political shock so intense that the system collapses before it can recover. This doctrine, sometimes called shock and awe, assumes that the enemy's power structure behaves like a pyramid. Remove the leadership at the top and the entire structure crumbles. But Iran did not build a pyramid. It built a network. Instead of concentrating authority in one place, Iran spent decades dispersing it. Military facilities hidden in mountains, missile systems buried underground, command structures distributed across multiple layers of leadership. Even more importantly, Iran invested heavily in relationships far beyond its own borders, proxy groups across the Middle East, allied militias embedded within regional conflicts, strategic partnerships that allow Iran to project influence without deploying its own army. The result is something that looks less like a traditional military structure and more like a web, and webs are extremely difficult to destroy. Cut one strand and the structure still holds. Cut several strands and the pressure simply shifts somewhere else. That means even a highly successful bombing campaign may not achieve the political collapse it was designed to produce. But military structure is only part of the equation. The deeper dimension of this conflict lies in psychology, because wars are ultimately decided by political will. Before this war began, Iran was facing serious internal tensions. Economic hardship had fueled protests. Public frustration with corruption and political repression was growing. For the Iranian government, internal legitimacy was becoming a real concern. But external conflict has a strange effect on internal politics. When a country experiences foreign attack, divisions inside the population often begin to narrow. Citizens who once protested their own government may suddenly see the situation through a different lens, one defined by national survival rather than domestic reform. History shows this pattern again and again. In times of external threat, populations often rally around the state, even if they disagree with its leadership, and that shift can dramatically stabilize regimes that were previously under pressure. In other words, the very act of attacking a government can sometimes strengthen it politically. This dynamic is especially powerful in countries where national identity and historical memory emphasize resistance against foreign domination. In Iran, that narrative runs deep. For centuries, Persian political culture has been shaped by the idea of resisting external control. That cultural memory makes foreign intervention particularly effective at mobilizing nationalist sentiment. Which brings us to the second layer of Iran's long war strategy: regional leverage. Iran does not fight alone. Over decades, it has cultivated relationships with groups across the Middle East that share overlapping political or ideological interests. Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq, forces operating in Syria, the Houthis in Yemen. Each of these actors operates with its own motivations and its own leadership, but collectively they form a strategic ecosystem. And that ecosystem dramatically expands the geographic scope of any conflict involving Iran. Instead of a single battlefield, the war can unfold across multiple fronts simultaneously. Missiles launched from Lebanon, drone attacks originating from Yemen, militia activity targeting bases in Iraq, shipping routes threatened in the Red Sea. Suddenly, the conflict is no longer contained within one country. It spreads across an entire region, and every additional front forces opposing forces to divide their attention. Air defenses must be redeployed, naval patrols expanded, intelligence resources stretched across a wider area. Over time, the logistical burden of maintaining those defenses grows heavier, and that burden is not purely military, it is economic. The Middle East sits at the center of global energy infrastructure. Major shipping routes carry enormous volumes of oil and natural gas through narrow maritime corridors. When those corridors become unstable, global markets react quickly. Oil prices rise, transportation costs increase. Manufacturing becomes more expensive, inflation spreads across supply chains. The economic impact of a regional war begins to ripple across the entire world. This is where geopolitics intersects with everyday life. Higher fuel prices affect food distribution. Shipping disruptions affect retail supply. Energy costs influence nearly every industry. Suddenly, a conflict thousands of miles away begins showing up in household budgets, and that matters politically, because democratic governments must respond to voters. When wars begin affecting everyday economic stability, political pressure increases rapidly. Legislators begin questioning long-term strategy. Public protests emerge. Media coverage shifts from battlefield updates to debates about cost. This political pressure has shaped the outcome of many modern conflicts: Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. In each case, military capability alone did not determine the result. Political endurance did. Iran's strategy appears designed to exploit exactly that dynamic. It does not need to defeat the United States militarily. It simply needs to extend the conflict long enough that the political and economic cost becomes unsustainable. Meanwhile, the United States faces another challenge: global commitments. American military power operates across multiple regions simultaneously: deterrence against China in the Pacific, security commitments in Europe, strategic interests in the Arctic, diplomatic tensions in several other regions. Each of these responsibilities draws from the same pool of resources. When one conflict intensifies, it inevitably affects readiness elsewhere. Military planners describe this situation as strategic overextension, not because the United States lacks strength, but because strength must be distributed across multiple theaters, and adversaries around the world are always watching for moments when attention becomes divided. Which leads us to another critical player in this unfolding situation: Saudi Arabia. The kingdom sits at the center of the region's energy infrastructure and plays a pivotal role in the balance of power in the Gulf. Officially, Saudi Arabia maintains a careful diplomatic position, but its geographic location makes it extremely vulnerable to regional instability. Key oil facilities lie within range of missile and drone attacks. Any disruption to those facilities would send shockwaves through global energy markets. Saudi leadership therefore faces an extremely delicate balancing act: maintaining security partnerships, protecting domestic stability, preserving economic confidence. Any shift in Saudi strategy could dramatically alter the trajectory of the conflict. All of these factors point toward the same conclusion: this war contains the structural ingredients of a long conflict, not a quick campaign, not a sudden collapse, a prolonged geopolitical struggle. And wars like that rarely end with dramatic victories. They end with exhaustion, with negotiations that satisfy neither side completely, with geopolitical landscapes reshaped slowly over time. The question now is not simply who has the stronger military. The question is who can sustain the pressure longer. Which political system can endure prolonged economic disruption? Which alliances remain stable under stress? Which populations maintain support for their governments? Those variables will ultimately decide how this conflict ends. And right now, the deeper structural forces driving this war suggest something sobering. The world may not be witnessing the beginning of a short crisis. It may be witnessing the opening chapter of a much longer geopolitical struggle, a struggle defined not by rapid victories, but by endurance. And in wars of endurance, time itself becomes the most powerful weapon of a